Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our first event of 2021. Happy New Year, with Michael Posner in conversation with Robert Faggen, here to discuss Leonard Cohen, Untold Stories, The Early Years, Volume 1. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website by signing up for our email newsletter, as well as following us on social media at BookSoup. And you can even follow our Crowdcast page and find our past events on our YouTube channel. Our next event is scheduled for next week, January 12th at 6 p.m. with Matteo Ascaripour in conversation with actor Jay Ellis and poet Sasha Banks to discuss Matteo's debut novel, Black Buck. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And if you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, you can click the like button, and it'll bump it up in the queue. And we'll try to answer as many questions as time will allow. And you can also please feel free to use the chat area to engage with each other as well. And please support Book Soup and our author tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, which you can do by clicking on the green purchase button right below the viewer screen. It will redirect you to our website where you can finish the checkout process. It won't interrupt the viewing, so you can do that at any time you wish. And we're also selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those interested. And with that said, let me introduce our guest speakers for this evening. Our in conversation guest tonight is Robert Faggen, who is a professor of literature at Claremont McKenna College in California, as well as a Guggenheim National Endowment for the Humanities and Graves Fellow. He has written many critical works, including the Cambridge Introduction to Robert Frost and Robert Frost and the Challenge of Darwin. Faggen has edited writing collections such as the Cambridge Companion to Robert Frost, as well as the Random House edition of Leonard Cohen's poems and lyrics. He also edited with Leonard on his last book, The Flame. Our featured author tonight is Michael Posner, who is an award-winning writer, playwright, journalist, and the author of 7 books. These include the Mordecai Rickler biography, The Last Honest Man, and the Anne Murray biography, All of Me, both of which were national bestsellers. He was Washington bureau chief for Maclean's magazine and later served as its national foreign and assistant managing editor. He was also managing editor of the Financial Times of Canada for 3 years. He later spent 16 years as a senior writer with the Globe and Mail. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to our guests tonight. Thank you both so much for joining us for our very first event. We're so excited to have you. And everyone, thank you for joining. Sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Michael, I've enjoyed immensely reading the first volume of this very complex story.
Thank you.
And I have my copy all, try to show it here, all marked up with Post-its. And maybe I'll get to a few of those, but let's just start with some general questions. Of course, what drew you to creating a biography of Cohen?
That's an easy one in a way, because just look at what the man achieved in his life.
Mm-hmm.
The numerous books of poetry, the 2 novels, and then all those fantastic musical albums with those amazing songs. I mean, it's an extraordinary life just from the creative side, and then to explore his spiritual dimensions, both in Judaism and Christianity and Zen Buddhism. And then, needless to say, his romantic life, which was highly complicated.
Right.
It's a very rich tapestry, so it was very inviting.
Now, I mean, obviously, Cohen is an enormous figure both in Canada but throughout the world. There have been biographies and studies of Cohen. What led you to decide to do an oral biography?
Well, one factor clearly was the fact that there were several quite good biographies of Leonard already out, each of them having their own merits, but basically very solid biographies. I did have a sense that they weren't complete, that there was more to be discovered about his life.
Well, most of them were published before his death.
Oh, yes. In fact, all of them were published before his death.
Right.
That's taking nothing away from them. They're good books, but I did feel they were essentially incomplete, that there was more to be had. By the same token, I am by inclination partial, for whatever reason, to the oral biography form, because I think it allows for a richer array of voices to come to the table. And I didn't want to impose my own interpretation of Leonard or my own viewpoint of Leonard. I wanted to let the people who actually knew him say what they had to say about him, whether or not they agreed or disagreed. In fact, I think that's one of the virtues of oral biography, is that people will frequently disagree, and the reader has to make his or her own determination about who's telling the truth here, or where the balance of truth probably lies. That might be a better way to put it. So I like the format of oral biography, and in many respects, it's easier. It's I think, a true biographer doing a more conventional one, that's a tougher road, I think. But I assumed that there were a lot of people who had stories about Leonard that we hadn't heard from, and my research bore that out.
Were there ever moments when, and of course, there are times when you interject your own prose into the narrative. Did you ever feel strong desire to interpret what people were saying?
Sometimes I did. I tried to resist that temptation. What I would more be inclined to do was to try out my interpretation on interviewees and let them have a go at it.
Right.
And I'd accept their go, whatever their go was, whether it agreed with me or not. It was just more grist for the Leonard Cohen mill in a sense. But I tried to resist the temptation to impose my own view. That's not what this book is about.
Okay. This is maybe a more difficult question, but I want to refer to a passage in your book. Just give me a second here and I'll get it. Yes, it's a comment by Howard Astor, who was a publisher of one of Leonard's friends, Henry.
Yep.
Cohen learned how to create a public persona, a false persona. He played games with his public and with the media. He did it all his life. He was a master. He learned that from Irving, the first Canadian poet to do it. Of course, you end up fooling yourself every now and then. Cohen's persona applies to what is written about him, not what he wrote. You have to separate the two. The conundrum is, how do they fit together? How did you find? I mean, he ends that as a question. Did you find that how they fit together in writing the book?
I don't think so, and I'm not sure that I will, even at the end of the next two volumes. I think, Leonard Cohen, I hope, will emerge from this as this very complicated, multi-dimensional human being who contains multitudes, and it is hard work to figure out where to draw the line between the man and the persona. But I think you put your finger on a very salient point and an interesting quote by Howard Astor, because I think there is a distinction to be made between the Leonard Cohen that the world essentially has come to know through his performances and his interviews and his TV appearances, etc., and the real man. I think there is a distinction to be made, and what I'm trying to do to some extent, I think, in this book and the others, is to get closer to who the real man was, to the more authentic Leonard Cohen.
How would you best characterize one of, or maybe several of, his public personae?
Well, the world largely knows him as this infallibly gracious, kind, generous, humorous, intelligent, courteous, almost Edwardian gentleman.
Yes.
And that's not false.
Right.
None of that is false. He was all of that. He wasn't putting on an act. That's an honest and authentic dimension of his character.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there was another Leonard Cohen in there who could be angry, jealous, spiteful, difficult, ornery, and more negative qualities. I mean, he was a human being,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's a mistake. I mean, it's fine to idolize him and worship the work that he did, because it's high quality work that will last for a very long time. But I think it's wrong to sanctify him and turn him into a saint. I think he was a human being, and a flawed human being, and I think it's better if we understand that. And in fact, I would say that nobody understood that better than Leonard himself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can go through his song lyrics and his poems, and it's mostly the skin off his own back that he's tearing away.
Mm-hmm.
Often.
Do you think, in using that figure, tearing the skin off his own back, do you think that he's trying to get to some truth about himself?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think he's definitely trying to get to some truth about himself and about all of us. Why we're here. I was just an hour or two before we began this conversation, I was listening to one of his songs, Boogie Street,
Right.
which ends, or come near the end, has this famous line about nobody knows what Boogie Street is for. Nobody
Right.
knows why we're here. And I think he was wrestling with that all his life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me start a little bit about his childhood. What did you learn about his mother from doing this biography? I mean, she seems like a very, as she comes through in your book, she's a very complicated woman, and perceived in different ways. You know, how did what kind of contradictions did you see in her, and what was Leonard's relationship with her?
I think his relationship with her was complicated. I mean, obviously, it evolved from childhood through adolescence into adulthood. So it's not a static relationship. I think it's a love-hate relationship in some respects. I mean, he clearly loved his mother on many levels, but at the same time, as much as she loved him and encouraged him in his artistic pursuits, whatever they were, from childhood through to adulthood, she could be a more traditional Jewish, hovering, to some extent, smothering Jewish mother.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly in an environment where he had lost his father at the age of 9, and he is
Yes.
left there with his mother and older sister. I'm playing armchair psychologist here, but you have to conclude that the need to escape from that must have been pretty strong, and then you couple that with the pressure that he no doubt felt from the wider Cohen family to be enlisted in the Cohen family businesses, for which he would have been entirely unsuitable from any point of view, and so he needed to escape, and he was strong enough to do that. Not everybody would have been, but he was a strong guy. He knew what he wanted to do, and he was determined to give it a go.
That's
So,
one of the strong impressions I get from the book, is that Leonard was kind of on a mission in his own way from very early on.
absolutely. I mean, absolutely. He knew he wanted to write, and he would be very modest about saying, I don't know if I can do this. Well, I'll give it a shot. Maybe I'll end up in law school, maybe I'll end up in the family business, but I have to try this. But I think in his heart of hearts, he was determined not to go into the business, not to become a professor of English anywhere. He was going to be a writer. It was at his very core. Um, so so he had to fight his mother on that, and I think he had to fight his uncles on that.
Mm-hmm.
But he did.
Mm-hmm.
He did.
No, and obviously he made a good go of it.
There's that famous little exchange. It's fictional, but I imagine it's dialogue that might well have occurred between him and his best friend Krantz, who is really modeled on his close real life friend Morton Rosengarten,
Mm-hmm.
in The Favorite Game, where he says to Krantz, you know, he has this kind of magical ability and magical faith in himself and his ability to make things happen. And that's what he says. He says, Krantz, I can make things happen. And
Right.
Krantz says, no, you can't. He says, yes, I can.
Mm-hmm.
And there is something magical about Leonard. I mean, you see it time and time again in performances, in childhood, at summer camp, as a hypnotist, you know, as a
That was
preteen.
that was a very interesting thing in your book, is you talk about these instances of hypnotism where he hypnotizes people, and he gets very good at it.
He is good. He was still doing it in the 90s.
Right.
He
Right.
would still invite people to sit for him to be hypnotized. He was uncanny. He had an ability to read people, he had a talent for that few people have. He could just sort of size up a situation in no time at all, and size up a human being. And his ability to do that meant that he could meet you on your terms. He could
Right.
figure out what your needs were, and he could deliver the persona of Leonard Cohen that needed to fit that situation.
So he was, I mean, not quite a shapeshifter, but
Yeah, it's authentic. You know,
authentic.
it's not false. It's I guess you could say it's contrived, but it's genuine. He was meeting you on your terms. There's an anecdote in the second book where he's sitting on a beach with a friend of his,
Mm-hmm.
and they turn and they see this older Greek gentleman who Leonard does not know walking towards the water. And he's an older man, and Leonard stands up, as you might for a woman on a bus, to give her your seat. And the friend who he's sitting with kind of is puzzled. Why are you standing for this guy who's just walking by you? He's not
Mm-hmm.
coming to say hello. And he says, because that's the respect that you give to your elders.
Right.
And it's just that sense of it's not noblesse oblige, but it's a sense of doing the right thing for people.
Well,
Putting yourself in the other man's shoes.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a kind of tension too in Leonard between wanting to break through with that which is new and revolutionary, and yet another side to him that's actually fairly conservative.
Absolutely true. On the creative side, he's constantly trying to reinvent himself. There's, you know, you look at the albums, you look at the poetry. He almost never tries to repeat himself or do what he's previously done. He's always looking for something new. But in terms of his personal behavior, he is deeply conservative, I think. I'm not just referring to politics. I think he was conservative in politics as well. But just in terms of he's a very discreet. He behaved with great discretion, as
Right.
best he could.
Right. And yet, and we have this even in the first volume, his relationships with women are very complicated. How would you characterize his? Is there any general way you could characterize his relationships?
Well, there's a few things to be said. One is that he had an enormously strong libido. That's pretty evident.
Right.
I mean, and he was really struck to the core by beauty, and
Right.
I think to some extent, you know, there was the challenge of the seduction, the quest,
Right.
but there was also material. You know, these women were material for his creative life, for his poems and his songs, and he absolutely saw them that way. And in fact, you might even argue that they were more important than any personal relationship that he had with any woman. That it was the material more than anything that was
Mm-hmm.
the motivation.
And so, and one can see this from early on. His ambition as a writer was in a way first and foremost.
I absolutely believe that. I mean, but he had this strong libido. He loved women. He loved to be with them. When he was with them, he had this extraordinary ability to be only with them. There was never a distraction that would
Right.
take his gaze away from you.
Right.
And this was deeply appealing to many women. This
Hmm.
ability to be completely present and focused and engaged in a way that few men are able to be, I think.
But in some ways also unwilling to commit.
Oh, totally unwilling to commit. Totally unwilling to commit, and to some extent saddled with a bit of a double standard in the sense that he saw nothing wrong with his own desire to sleep with as many women as possible, but would be jealous of women who decided to sleep with other men.
But that comes through in your book, that one of the things that Leonard got juice from, as it were, is being cuckolded.
Yes, it happens a couple times, and he does. He creates a song. His own first cousin is responsible for cuckolding him when he's still in his 20s,
Right.
and the cousin says, I don't think it was such a big deal for him. He was okay with it.
Right.
And I mean, it may be that he was looking for an exit visa from that relationship anyway. We don't
Right.
really know.
Right.
But so yeah, very, very reluctant to commit. And as you know, although he was associated with many lovely women through the years, some for a short time, some for a longer time, he never actually marries anybody, not even the
No.
mother of his children.
Right. Right. Um, he never seems to speak about his father, and yet one suspects his father's death played an enormous role in his life. Can you
It
speculate on
had,
that a little bit?
yeah, for sure. I mean, it had to have played an enormous role in his life. He was 9 when he died. I mean, how well could he have known his father even at 9 years old?
Right.
He does speak about him occasionally in interviews when he's asked about it, and you do get a kind of a sense of who the father was, um, but he can't have had any sort of serious relationship with his father at the time. And you could argue that at least two of the central characters in his adult life, Irving Layton from 1954 and 1955 on, for a few decades at least, and then subsequently Sasaki Roshi, the Zen master,
Yes.
become genuine father figures. Sasaki Roshi even more than Layton,
Right.
um, and to some extent there is a kind of he was left with a hole there that had to be filled at some level, and those men largely filled it.
In the case of Leighton and maybe also Roshi, this is maybe getting ahead of things. Um, are some of these figures related to Leonard's sense of a spiritual quest?
Not Layton. Um, Layton Layton gave him an appetite for life, an appetite for experimentation.
Hmm.
The carpe diem, stay up till
Right.
3 a.m. every night for as long as you can,
Right.
taste every experience. I think that's what Layton gave him. Roshi comes at him as a completely different kind of entity, a deeply spiritual guy on one level, and also a very flawed human being as well, as you probably know, and
Oh yes.
as we will discover, um, but but capable of great insights. And Leonard, Leonard said many times, he said, it, the relevant fact wasn't that he was a practitioner of Zen Buddhism. The relevant fact was that this guy was a
Hmm.
fireball of
Hmm.
energy that could consume you and could look deep within you and in 5 minutes deduce every problem you ever had.
Right.
And Leonard got off on that. There's just no question
Right.
about it.
Right.
And was willing to forgive Sasaki Roshi his many sins because of it.
Um, Shifting gears just a little bit, there's a great autobiographical element in Leonard's poetry and in his songwriting.
I agree.
Uh, I'm reminded of a story that, or something that Leonard said to me once. A friend of mine mentioned that a girlfriend of his who had known Leonard knew what the monkey and the plywood violin represented. And I brought this up with Leonard, and with a smile. And Leonard said, hasn't anybody ever heard of a metaphor? So, I notice in your book that you get into, for example, some of the issues behind Famous Blue Raincoat.
Right.
What did you learn about some of his songs from doing the biography? Their relationship to his actual life.
Well, remember, for book volume 1, we're just dealing really with one album essentially, or
Right.
The second one I think comes out just at the end of the book, or just at the start of the second volume.
Right.
So there will be a little more explanation or discussion of some of those songs in future. There was a woman who gave him a plywood violin with a monkey.
There it is.
It absolutely happened. There's a woman who cut his hair on a kitchen chair, right from the lyric of Hallelujah.
Right.
I think that that's a rich area to explore. Most of the people that I'm interviewing, and it's an oral biography, as we know, so I'm constrained to some extent by their ability to interpret those lyrics.
Right.
And most of them probably can't. They don't know Leonard on that level. And he was pretty oblique often about, as you know personally, about discussing some of those lyrics. He didn't like to explain them.
That's right.
He preferred not to, and rightly so, I think. They speak to people on different levels, and as they should.
Right.
So I think that that's a rich vein for either a future biographer or a future academic, is to try to connect the dots between the personal life that he led, to some extent as it's explained or exposed in these books, and who he's writing about often in these poems, if he's not in fact writing about himself, which he often is.
When did Leonard's spiritual quest start to expand, from Judaism into, for example, the I Ching, or Buddhism?
So I think that happened sort of in the early 60s. He had a friend who dies in 1972 named Robert Hirschhorn, who to some extent was a few light years ahead of Leonard in terms of his willingness to explore these spiritual dimensions, and who went into the I Ching first, and who went into Sufism first, and who introduced Leonard to some of these Eastern religions and Eastern mysticisms. I don't think he did that on his own. I think this was derived from Hirschhorn. But he was deeply interested in it, for sure, and subsequently began to explore it quite deeply. Excuse me. So, and Judaism comes a bit later, because I think at one point he's already been into the Zen world for a number of years, and he injures his knees sitting in sesshin, and he can't sit for a while, and he begins to explore Kabbalah and starts to read some of the great Kabbalah texts, and starts studying with a rabbi. That's in the late 70s.
Yes, and he was an avid reader of the Zohar.
And he's an avid reader of the Zohar, and he becomes also, he's interested in Christianity. I mean, he's interested in Thomas Merton, and he's interested in some of the great classic Christian thinkers. That's a lifelong quest. He was very serious about this stuff.
Yes.
He was even as late as 2010, 2011, he's still doing online chats with rabbis to discuss.
Yes, I think that's
discuss this stuff. This never left him. He was a serious student.
And of course, that's part of his background.
It's part of his background. He was not a guy who, went to synagogue on every high holiday. He certainly did occasionally light Friday night candles, and he'd have a
Oh, he
challah,
did.
and he did the blessings. Yes, he absolutely did. But the ritual, he enjoyed the ritual for the sake of the ritual, and
Yes.
the historic element, the tradition, the Jewish tradition of it. But I think what really turned him on was the intellectual depth. I mean, after 205, he becomes a member at a temple in Los Angeles, where the
Yes.
rabbi was a Kabbalah scholar, and he's
Rabbi Finley.
Rabbi Mordecai Finley, who was a brilliant guy, and he starts to attend not just Saturday Sabbath services, but to his Monday night lectures.
Right.
So this is Judaism was deeply rooted in him.
Yes. What of materials were available to you to work on this book, and what materials were not available to you that might have been helpful?
Well, it's an oral biography, so to some extent, I was trying to avoid materials. I mean, obviously,
Right.
I needed to look at his own writings, because to the extent that they're autobiographical, I wanted to try to see what clues I could discern in them that would offer me some hints about where he was at a specific time. I'm trying to build the book chronologically and be as accurate as possible. So sometimes he'll date a poem. He'll say Idra 1963 or whatever, or even give you the month sometimes. So that was important to know where he was. There is, of course, his archive at the University of Toronto.
Yes.
Now, I think what we would call the juicier parts of it are off limits for probably 50 years,
Right.
under his instructions. And the juicier parts, I assume, would be diaries and letters between him and his mother, him and his sister, him and his lovers, that he did not want to expose, and would rather wait until everybody ever mentioned in them is no longer with us before they're open to the public. But for me, as an oral biographer, that's a bit of a trap, because there's a copyright on these documents. You can't just lift the material and publish it. So I kind of avoided the archives.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in all the writings that have been done about Leonard, and all his magazine interviews, his newspaper interviews, his television interviews.
Right.
That kind of material I obviously had to pursue aggressively. But his archive and his own letters and diaries, I mean, I'd love to read it, but I think it would have been a trap for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What did you find were questions brought up, especially for this first volume, that you'd like to go into more deeply?
Well,
or that remain unresolved?
There's a few. I mean, there's some childhood friends that were important to him, that for whatever reason chose not to participate in the book.
Mm-hmm.
The most important of those being Morton Rosengarten, who I alluded to earlier. Morton is his friend from, I don't know, the age of 10 perhaps, and they are best bosom buddies
Yes.
for many, many years. And I can only imagine that in the archive of Morton Rosengarten's own memory, there are many, many insights and stories, not just stories, but insights into who this guy was at that time. And so I deeply regret that Morton chose not to participate. But you do what you can, and
You do what you
move
can.
on. There's Nancy Bacall is another childhood friend that he was quite close to.
Right.
And she is, and this I encountered more than once. There are people who want to write their own memoir of Leonard.
Oh, yes.
And therefore the material is theirs, and I totally understand that. That's
right.
That's just the way it works. And one of his first great loves, not his first love, but Annie Sherman.
Yes.
Who was his girlfriend from roughly 1957, 1958. And she too is writing her own memoir of that relationship. And so she declined to speak to me at any length. So listen, I don't want to pretend for a moment that this book or even the three books together will constitute something that's categorically definitive, because
Mhm.
I'm not sure there is such a thing as a definitive biography. People are
No,
much too
there
people are too
probably isn't.
complex, and Leonard Cohen is way too complex.
Yes, that's true. Well, I don't. I would want to open it up to questions now. From I think there are 80 some odd people watching, and I don't want to hog all your time. So
Go for it.
maybe we can open this up to some questions from the audience.
Are there any?
Well, I see there are two questions here. What song of Leonard Cohen do you listen to the most, and why?
There's so many that I love. Boogie Street I referred to earlier. If It Be Your Will, I think is an amazing song.
Mm-hmm.
I like Hallelujah, but I think it's of course been a victim of overkill to some extent by the hundreds of covers that have been done of it. And I think it's largely misinterpreted. I think you and I have maybe discussed this in the past, that the conventional interpretation of it is probably inaccurate. It isn't it isn't what it appears to be. I love Dance Me to the End of Love. I love Famous Blue Raincoat. I love some of his later stuff where he didn't actually write the music. Sharon Robinson wrote the music, or Patrick Leonard wrote the music,
Right.
and it's his lyrics. And there's a couple songs on the album that Anjani Thomas did, Blue Alert, including the song Blue Alert, and another one called Half the Perfect World.
Yes.
Which I think are spectacular lyrics, just spectacular, and beautiful melodies. She wrote the melodies, Anjani, for those two songs.
Right.
And they're both amazing.
Yes.
So anyway, but we could be here all night discussing songs of Leonard Cohen.
Oh, yes. There's just a question here. Is Susan Elrod still living?
Very much. From the very selfish vantage point of Michael Posner, she's another one who got away. And she could write her own book about Leonard, because that's a relationship that spans roughly a decade, and
two children.
And two children. I was just going to say, so and a very complicated relationship as well.
Right.
You might say that about all of that. You might say that about all of Leonard's relationships. They're all kind of complicated, but so at some point, perhaps she will divest herself of these stories and observations. I don't know if that'll happen, but so far she has declined to participate.
Let's see here. I'm just looking at some of the questions. One question here is, what drew Leonard to Greece?
So he wanted to write a novel. That was his. He got a grant to write a novel from the Canada Council, a couple $1,000. The story is that he kind of discovered Greece by accident, by walking into a bank in London one rainy day and seeing a bank teller with a tan and saying, "Where did you get the tan?" And he said, "Well, I come from Greece." And he said, "Is the sun shining there?" And he said, "It always shines in Greece."
Right.
And the next day he took a plane to Greece. The reality is he was going to Greece anyway. It was part of the terms of his Canada Council grant that he was going to go to Rome, to Greece, and to Israel, and to write this novel. So I think it was a bit serendipitous. He met a guy in London who said he should go to Idra and look up a family, and so he did, and he fell in love with Idra. So this is spring of 1960.
Right. Another question here. Can you explain talk a little bit about his relationship to Los Angeles? Did he live out of here because of the Mount Baldy, or why did he? What was his relationship to LA?
Yeah, Mount Baldy is certainly an important factor, because he lived an hour away by car from Mount Baldy, basically. The music industry, the talented musicians, producers, the studios, much of that is in LA. Obviously, there was some of that in Montreal, and he used some of it, but it's largely in New York and in LA. Leonard loved a good suntan, and LA's weather certainly appealed to him a lot more
Oh,
than Montreal's.
he did like the weather. That's true. But he kept his home in Montreal.
He kept his home in Montreal, and he was back 2 or 3 or more times a year, never for long. I mean, another aspect of his character is that, and people refer to him as this kind of will of the wisp character he's here today and gone tomorrow. They would turn around and he would have left town, or they'd turn around and he'd have arrived. And so he's a week here, a week there, 3 days here, 4 days there. He's kind of constantly on the move. The geographical movement kind of mirrors his romantic movements to some extent.
Yeah.
So Zen Buddhism, weather, music. I think those were the draws for LA. Yeah.
I have a question here. Did Leonard ever feel insecure about his music melody since he was so heavily regarded as the master of lyrics?
Yeah, I think he was completely insecure. Not so much about the lyrics, because he would work at them and work at them and work at them until he was satisfied that he had something that he could be reasonably proud of. I think on the musical side, there was a much higher level of insecurity. Musicians that he worked with in the 70s noticed that insecurity and were quite struck by it.
Well, Hammond, you talk about, you mentioned Hammond, or Hammond speaks in your biography as, sensing that the musicians were making fun of Leonard, sensing that the musicians were making fun of him.
Yeah, and he knew that he didn't have enormous guitar skills. He had limited guitar skills. The skills that he did quite well with.
Yes, I'd say.
He exhausted the potential of those 6 chords, but
Right.
I think he did feel that musically he was quite unsophisticated, and so if you put him in a room with guys who went to Juilliard, as he sometimes was, the insecurities were apparent to them. But here's the interesting thing about that: these guys would come out of Juilliard, or they would come out of Austin, Texas, with great backgrounds in jazz or backgrounds in classical music. They could do anything, and they would do anything. They would improvise and do these riffs, and then they were introduced to Leonard Cohen, and suddenly they saw that less was more. That in stripping these songs down to their basic roots, to get at the space between the notes, as somebody says, that was for them an eye-opening experience. They came away, notwithstanding the fact that they thought he was unsophisticated musically, they came away with enormous respect for the philosophical underpinnings of his music, if you will.
Okay, let me see here. Here's a question. How do you account for the fact that this guy was not really a great singer at all, and yet he became a star singer?
So he addresses that a number of times, and I think he hits the nail on the head, because he says, if I want to hear a singer, I can go to the Metropolitan Opera. That's a singer. I'm not a singer in that sense. The kind of singer I am is that I will give you emotional authenticity. I will be true to the meaning of the song, to the core of the song, to the message of the song, and I will be as true to that every night in performance, whether I'm in Europe or Australia or in Canada or wherever. And that's no mean trick, to put that sincerity and authenticity. Joe Cocker, Tom Waits, all kinds of guys don't have the greatest musical voices, but they're authentic. And I think Leonard is authentic in the same way. He's he's giving you honesty. He has the famous song, the singer must die for the lie in his voice. And he didn't want to be a liar. He wanted to tell the truth as best he could and be faithful to the intent of the song. And so, I'm somewhat dismissive of the critiques of his voice per se. It's not a great voice as a qua voice, but he's genuine.
But he did cultivate that voice. As he grew older, it became a very powerful instrument.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if he cultivated it or the 500 cigarettes.
The cigarettes helped.
Every week cultivated his voice. But yes, I agree. And so it becomes very distinctive, and kind of a calling card in a way for him.
I have a question here. How do you think the legacies of Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen will play out over time?
That's a good question. They're both going to have adjoining suites in the penthouse of the Tower of Song, I would say.
Yes.
It's a really good question, because there was a lot of discussion at the time that Dylan was given the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016, and Leonard was not, and many Leonard Cohen fans were deeply offended and thought the Nobel Prize Committee had chosen the wrong guy, although just as many people felt they chose exactly the right guy. I think they chose Dylan because he's more commercial, he's more popular, he's better known. He sold a lot more records than Leonard Cohen ever did. But they might have done what they do in medicine or chemistry or physics and give the prize jointly to the two of them. They could easily have done that. Leonard was, as you know, very characteristically generous when Dylan was announced as the winner.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
And you would have expected nothing less from Leonard. But
his sense was that the Nobel Committee needed Dylan as much as Dylan needed the Nobel Prize.
I think that's a safe argument. I mean, the Nobel Prize Committee has to continue to be relevant to the new generation, and giving the award to Bob Dylan is a step in that direction.
Right. Let's see. We have a question here. Oh, can you expand on your interpretation of Hallelujah? Well, that's a tough one.
I think it's about the fickle absentee landlord called God, basically.
Right.
I mean, there's different verses of it mean different things, but I think at its core, we're talking about, where is this God that governs so much of our behavior and so much of our world in principle, and issuing the cry of hallelujah in spite of that yawning doubt that all of us have at the center of our being about whether there is in fact a God. I think it's a hallelujah in spite of that doubt, but I think that's what the song's about. I don't think it's a hymn of praise to God.
Right. As you know, I have a number of thoughts on that, but
I know.
Here's a question. Jews have adopted Leonard as a spiritual leader of sorts. Was he comfortable with that? Did he try to cultivate that persona?
No, he would have been deeply uncomfortable with any notion that he was a spiritual leader of the Jewish people. I think he would want to be a spiritual leader of all people, but he would have wanted Judaism or Jewishness to be taken out of that equation, even though he was Jewish and very proud of it. But he didn't want to speak only to Jews. He wanted to speak to everybody.
Here's a question. If you were to say one last thing to Leonard, what would you say to him, or maybe ask of him?
Oh my God, what a tough question. That is a toughie.
It's a tough one.
What would I say to him? I don't know. I'd like to maybe say, where's the third novel that you spent so much time trying to write and never produced? Or I would, have him walk me through the lyrics and say, who are we talking about here? Who is this Monica that appears several times in Death of a Ladies' Man, the poetry book. And, because he's writing his life here. These are his experiences. And these are real women that he's alluding to. Sometimes he changes the names, but these are real people.
Right.
And these were important relationships, or otherwise he wouldn't have committed them to poetry. And so I'd want to know more about the details, all of which, of course, he would decline to answer. But
Politely.
absolutely, he'd shut the door immediately. But I'd be curious about it.
Right. Let's see if we have another question here. This is after this book and your book on Anne Murray, are you planning any upcoming books on other Canadian artists?
Well, just for the record, there are 2 more Leonard Cohen volumes to come. This book
Right.
just takes us to 1970. The second book, which I hope will come out next fall, it's not clear when it'll end, but it'll probably end about 1986. So that's going to be another big fat book that only includes 16 years of his life. And then the third book at the moment would come out the following autumn and would take us through the rest of his life and his death, sadly. After that, it's too far. I can't see that far ahead.
Right. That's already quite a lot to cope with.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
But I'm enjoying every minute.
Great. Let's see. I don't see any other questions. There's the one anecdote. There are many. I mean, there are just so many marvelous little details in your book, but there's the one story of his, I guess it's a habit or something, of standing in front of the mirror.
Right.
And almost as though he wanted to make himself pare himself down or disappear. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Apparently, he and Marianne Illen, who was his muse and lover at the time on Idro, would do this. They would prepare themselves for going out in the evening by staring at themselves in the mirror, and in Leonard's case, trying to find a kind of body language that would make him essentially invisible to people. And then there are people who will say, and indeed he was able to do that. You would see him on the porch, but he would never be standing out. You would discover him by accident because he'd look like nobody important. He'd just be a guy sitting at a table in a bar outside, and he was able to do that. Then there's another story that isn't in this volume, but comes later, where a guy comes over to Leonard's house, and he watches Leonard spend an hour in the mirror practicing poses, different poses, not necessarily maybe to disappear, but just practicing different expressions.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there was something quite studied about Leonard. It wasn't always off the cuff.
Right.
He was very conscious of that persona, and very conscious of his appearance, the clothes that he wore. He had a standard that he wanted to measure up to, and he worked very hard to measure up to it.
He started dressing in his elegant way from a fairly early age, didn't he?
Yeah, although he goes through phases, like in the early touring years, he's in army fatigues and leather jackets, and it's a lot less elegant. It's a little more derivative of the post-hippie period, I think.
He never liked to wear jeans.
I don't think he ever wore jeans, and I'm not
Never
sure
wore
I
jeans.
don't think I ever saw him in a baseball cap. Have you?
No,
I don't think so.
never.
He would wear any hat, but not a baseball cap.
Not a baseball cap.
It was
no.
It was too déclassé.
He didn't like umbrellas either. That's just another.
Oh, I don't think I knew that. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I did. That's a good one. I'll have to find a place for that.
Yeah. No, he didn't like umbrellas much. What did you learn about Leonard through your research that most surprised you?
I don't know that it surprised me, but the work ethic, especially in this early period, although I think it persists for many, many years. I don't think it ever really changed much. He had an enormous work ethic. But by that, I don't mean that he sat down at a desk for 12 hours consecutively, although he did do that at times. Um, there is a story about him. I don't know that it's in this book. I think it's later, where a friend of his is visiting. He's actually hired this friend to clean up his archive, and he comes over and he sees Leonard hunched over his word processor or his typewriter, and he goes upstairs to work on the archive, which basically meant collecting strips of paper that Leonard had thrown into plastic bags and trying to organize them. And he's there for several hours, and he comes downstairs and he says Leonard hadn't moved. He's in exactly the same position that he was several hours earlier. Um, you know, you look at his lyrics, and they appear to be so effortless and simple, but to get to that level of simplicity and effortlessness is actually very hard work.
Absolutely.
And so he worked really hard at stripping things away and getting to the essence. Conscious of rhyme and conscious of meter and all the things that poets would be conscious of, and conscious of theme and message and metaphor and all of that, and double meanings and double entendres. But he worked really hard at that stuff. So I don't know that I would say that surprised me, but I was really struck by it because it's clear that he was a craftsman.
We have a question here about Leonard's infatuation with Nico. That comes up in your book.
It does come up.
What do you make of that?
You can divide, to some extent, you can divide Leonard's women into the two categories: the Madonna and the whore. And sometimes the Madonna is the blonde, and sometimes the whore is the brunette. But and I'm not sure where. I guess Nico would be the Madonna. She's unattainable.
Right. He never actually had a.
He never had a relationship with her of any, not even a one night stand.
No.
She spurned him. She said he was too old.
Yes.
And to be honest, I don't know that I've brought much new to that story. I mean, maybe there's newness to be had, but it's been pretty well told in the previous books. And, that's one of the dilemmas that somebody like me faces, is that on the one hand, you're looking for new material, but on the other hand, you can't it's a biography. You can't ignore the old material. So you still have to include it. So there is a kind of genuflection in the direction of that Nico story. But I'm short of finding a diary by Nico or somebody else who was intimate and knew them. I think that story is pretty much exhausted.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Have you collected any of Leonard's art? When did he start really showing an interest in drawing and painting?
I think in the 90s, when he's during his period at Mount Baldy, he becomes kind of interested, and there's stuff he starts to do on the computer, and then when the iPad emerges, he becomes interested in that. Although he drew from childhood, and he always had the talent.
Right.
There's a story. Morton Rosengarten was a great sculptor and a great line drawer, and he would do wonderful illustrations. And there's a story about Morton is doing a drawing of a particular woman, and Leonard arrives at the studio, and he takes it as a kind of challenge to see whether he can do as good a line drawing of the woman as Morton. So he does it, and then he writes better than Morton's on the drawing. So there was a certain competitive
right.
edge there. So he took art classes in childhood, and he had the talent. And you look at some of the art that he did that went for sale in the early 2000s, and it's pretty good. He was good.
Yes. Oh yes. Let's see. What do you think, Cohen? Oh, did Leonard work as hard on his music as he did on his lyrics?
Oh, for sure he did. For sure he did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some other stuff, in the archive musically that may come to light one day. I think there's songs that he wrote that he decided weren't good enough um, that we may discover one day. Some of it is buried away. I know he worked with um, when he was doing Take This Waltz. Initially, it was done for a Lorca retrospective album in the mid '80s, and he worked with some Jean-Philippe Riquiel in Paris and Jean-Michel Rousset in Paris, and they worked on songs that they don't know where they are, including a song that's in a Bob Marley, a reggae song that Leonard wrote. Which they thought was pretty good, but Leonard didn't want to record. So
Right.
there is stuff. He did work hard on his stuff. He worked very hard on it.
Lorca, of course, was one of the most important early poetic influences. He sort of wore
Absolutely.
the way it's described in your book. He wore that copy of Lorca to shreds.
He did, and it spoke to him immediately. Like the metaphors in Lorca's poetry, it was like a light bulb went on for the 15-year-old Leonard Cohen. And frankly, to digress briefly, I think the same light bulb went on when he heard Bob Dylan for the first time.
Right.
I don't know that it immediately crystallized in his mind, I'm going to be a singer, but I think by the time he decided to be a singer, he thought, I could do what he's doing. I'm as good as that, certainly lyrically, and so I think hearing Dylan was a bit of a revelation for him too. But yes, Lorca's a huge influence, but there's others as well. W.B. Yeats, he was a huge student of W.B. Yeats, and others.
And the early musical influences are very broad. You have as people as diverse as Edith Piaf and Ray Charles.
Edith Piaf, Ray Charles. He liked some of the other Jacques Brel. He liked enormously, I think.
Right.
But even going back earlier, I mean, he's introduced to almost the Weavers and other folk groups in the 1950s.
Yes. Yes, that comes through in your book very clearly.
Political songs, basically, and even before that, he's introduced to synagogue melodies and Russian songs that his mother taught him.
Yes.
So music, and in his teenage years, I don't know that we've fully plumbed the depths of this, but I think he was a guy who really knew teenage music. The stuff that you would play in cafeteria jukeboxes.
Well, when you listen to an album which I think should be given more attention, "Death of a Ladies' Man,"
yeah,
you can hear his ear for those kind of pop tunes.
Absolutely. Nobody has yet. I tried to get to Phil Spector, who's in prison, of course.
Yes.
Having been convicted of murder, and I'd love to. Nobody has yet heard from Phil Spector on his story of how that album came to be, and we know that those were collaborative songs. And Phil, of course, comes from that great pop teenage tradition, so his stamp for sure is on some of those tunes. But yes, absolutely, those were songs from Leonard's adolescence, and he knew that world quite well.
Right. Well, we've been going for about an hour. Are there any other questions that I see a couple here? We've answered most of them. What do you think Leonard would think of your book?
I think he'd like it. And here's why. Here's why I think that. I think it gives a kind of what I call the Rashomon version of Leonard Cohen. That is to say, you have Leonard Cohen presented to you from several points of view, all of which are true, sometimes contradictory and conflicting, often ambiguous. But I think it gets, I hope it gets, and I think it gets, and I think he would recognize that it gets us a little closer to the human being,
Right.
not to the persona that we
Well,
we know,
or a persona.
or a persona.
Right.
So I think he'd like it.
Well, I think
But-
you would too.
Anyway, I hope so.
Well, that's about all from my end of things.
Okay.
I
Thank you for
don't
doing
know.
this.
I don't know if there are any other questions. I know a lot of people. Wait, there may be another one here. Someone is asking whether or not Suzanne Elrod lives in Paris still and works at the Louvre. My understanding is she's living in Florida.
She lives in Miami. She did live in Paris for a number of years, on 2 occasions actually, and did work at the Louvre as an illustrator for a while.
Right.
But she's been in Miami for a number of years.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, usually I would say this in front of a large audience. I guess I am saying it in front of a large audience, but I want to thank you,
Many
Michael
millions,
Posner,
many
for the
millions.
amazing book that you've pulled together and assembled. I don't know if there's quite the right word for it.
Yeah,
And
cut and paste.
for all your amazing research and insights into Leonard that are now being preserved. So I very much look forward to the next 2 volumes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting and asking these lovely questions. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight. This was a wonderful talk. Everyone, please support Michael. Purchase the book at the green button below. And thank you so much for your engagement, asking so many great questions and being active in the chat. It's always more exciting virtually when everyone's active. So we appreciate it. And thank you for joining Book Soup and supporting independent bookstores right now. And everyone, please take care and stay safe. And thank you both again, Michael and Robert, for joining us tonight. And everyone, take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.